Welcome back to the first episode of the second filming of Sheep Stuff You Should Know. We're here again with Dan Macon, Flying Mule Farms.
And Ryan Mahoney, Emigh Livestock, coming from California here. And it's a different week this week. We actually got some moisture up here. So, everything else is a little sour, but it's sure nice to have some grass.
Holy cow. We got in Rivas, how much rain did you get?
We got just under 4 inches in Auburn.
We got 2 1/4 in Rio Vista, 1.5 in Dixon. So it made our year.
What is your average rainfall in Dixon in a normal year?
19.
So you got like 10% of your rain over the weekend.
Yeah.
That's outrageous.
Yeah, and just absolutely zero runoff. Everything just went straight into the ground, and we needed it so bad.
Yeah.
It shows. I mean, if you get usually a 2-inch rainstorm in April, everything's flooding.
Yeah,
you can't even see it.
Yeah.
So.
We had a couple of downpours that came a little fast for it to soak in, so we had a little runoff, but I mean, our creeks haven't run all winter, and it was nice to see and hear water running for a change.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, before we jump into the topic, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
What was your best moment of the week? What was the best thing that happened? What was the best conversation, best moment, best get some positivity here?
Yeah. I'll have to give that a little thought. I think so we moved all of our sheep back into our summer pastures this week, yesterday actually. We try to get back on our irrigated pasture sometime right before water comes back on so we can start topping that feed off and keep it in good shape through the growing season. And for us being small scale, that means a lot of gooseneck loads with ewes and lambs, and loading ewes and lambs in a gooseneck is always an interesting way to spend the day. And we had no problems yesterday at all moving. So went like clockwork, almost like we knew what we were doing. And that was a good feeling to get to the end of the day yesterday and have everybody kind of put where they needed to be and settled in and not have had any wrecks or any problems with that. So it was a good day. How about you? What was the high point for you?
2 inches of rain and 75-degree weather the day after.
That would be the high point for me too.
Oh man. I mean, we were in serious trouble here in our hills. The filleries burned back. The feed was short. We were really worried we were going to have cow feed for the whole summer. And we're with this last rain, the ryegrass is just starting to come. And so this will really get it going. And it is the feed maker. So this is one of those, what do they call them? $10,000 rains, $20,000 rains. This
at least that. At least that. Yep.
Yeah. So what a great deal. We're going to finally start irrigating on Monday now. We're finally ready now with this rain, I'm ready for summer now. Now we got some feed in the spring, and I'm happy. Now I'm ready to start switching modes. So.
Well, and this will make a difference on our irrigated pasture too, because we're not having to catch up and fill the soil up before we can grow any grass. So
saves it saves at least an inch, when you're shooting over that first pass. It saves a lot of water when you get a good rain.
Yep.
So my guys were nervous. I had them, my cousins and everybody around us were irrigating the last 3 weeks, and I kept saying, nope, we got, it's too unsettled. We're going to get a good one. And I got lucky.
It's better to be lucky than good sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah, for sure. So the topic of the day, I'm excited to get into this topic. This is kind of, we posted that last video. There are a couple questions kind of came in related to this, but I thought this was kind of a good way to start. And really what I want to talk about is sheep. sheep are the first domesticated animal in the history of humanity.
Yep.
And there's a reason for that. It's their diversity. It's their, diverse genetically, diverse in their ability to interact with so many different types of environments. It's also their prolificness. They're able, they're incredibly fertile. They don't require the same water and nutrition needs as, say, a cow or some of these bigger proteins. They also are multi-use. So, you got your wool and you got milk for different breeds. And so I just wanted to start there and talk a little bit about the diversity of sheep. And so the first question that I got for you is you're sitting there in Auburn, California, and you got a feed resource and opportunities. How did you go about figuring out what animal species you wanted to use on your feed? And obviously you turned into sheep, but elaborate a little bit on that and why you made some of the genetic choices you made and maybe some of the mistakes genetically you made, and go into detail on some of that.
Oh, that's a great question. It's a great question. It addresses several of the questions we got during the week from our pilot episode. So this will be fun. When we got started with thinking about livestock, there's a certain cachet that goes with raising cattle in California. And so if you've got grass, you want to put cows on it because then you get to wear the cool clothes and hang out with the cool kids, right? But we realized here in our part of the foothills that there was an awful lot of fragmented pieces of grass available to us. So we could pick up 5 or 20 or 30 acres where it was really difficult to pick up 1,000 acres. And so from that standpoint, it really seemed that a small ruminant, sheep or goats, would fit those smaller pieces of ground, that we could fence them easy, that we could get animals in and out without a lot of infrastructure in the way of corrals or loading chutes or permanent infrastructure. And I maybe somewhat naively also thought that with little kids like we had when we started in this, that I'd rather have my kids helping me with a small animal than with a 1,200-pound cow that was trying to protect her calf. We've since learned a few lessons about sheep and that in terms of our safety, but that was one of the considerations for us too. I think the other thing you mentioned, diversity. Our foothill landscapes have kind of a diverse forage base. So we've got annual grasses and clovers and broadleaf plants, but we've got weeds that people want to control. We've got brush that can be a fire threat. And all of that diversity is something that we felt like we could use by grazing sheep better than we could by grazing cattle, that just their diverse dietary preferences was a real advantage for us too. Couple of the mistakes that we made, we did start with some sheep that had a predisposition to foot rot. And foot rot, if you haven't dealt with it, if you're in California, you've probably dealt with it at one point or another, at least in Northern California. But it was a real debilitating issue for us. And what we found was that for us, it was genetic. That the type of sheep that we were raising were more predisposed to it. And we found some genetics that had some resistance or at least some resilience to it. The other thing that we tried early on was raising some fine wool sheep, because we did want to be able to sell meat as well as wool. And we're kind of over that dividing line in terms of annual precipitation that make fine wool sheep workable. We bought some Rambouillet cross ewes, about 10 years ago now. And our average rain here in Auburn is 32, 33 inches per year. And those ewes never dried out in the wintertime. And so we had some pretty significant health problems with those fine wool sheep. and subsequently really focused on using kind of the UK 3-breed system because of our Rainfall, which it's more of a coarse wool, long wool type of breed, and they've been really successful for us in this environment. But we had to learn those things for ourselves. You can read about the fact that there's an issue with fine wool sheep in wetter climates, but until you've actually experienced it, you don't really know what those issues are. So, how about you? Your family's been in the sheep business for many generations, but what kept you in it, and kind of why do you stay in it?
That's a good question. It's definitely tied to the diversity of the animal. We run our user Rambouillet based ewe, so they're a pretty good fine wool. Our ewe clip, we tend to share about a 21.5 micron, 21 micron clip, and good 3 to 4 inches, 60% yield. We do good on our numbers. But what keeps us from going any more fine is that moisture issue. We're only about 19 inches, but we get it all at one time of the year in the winter, and you can even see it in our herd. You'll have some real ultra fine type sheep, and you can see the wool kind of doesn't, it opens up a little bit more, and it sogs on the top. And if you get a real wet year, you can actually get a little bit of wool rot right behind the ears. It'll actually grow a little mold, and so we always try to be right at that, 20 micron, 21 micron number. Get any finer than that, we run into problems. With those fine wooled sheep, you tend to run into some feet issues. In our area in the Montezuma Hills, you're familiar with, it's a real heavy clay. And so when it rains, it gets real wet and has a hard time drying out. And so it's real sticky. And so we do have foot issues that come with that. But recently we've been employing kind of the different EID tags and managing which ones have it, which ones don't. And we've been able to take our foot rot occurrences and I cut them by about 60% as a herd, simply by, not change our quality of wool or hopefully quality of lamb either, just through monitoring the genetics. But really, to me, that's a real good example of the diversity of genetics within sheep. Here you have a Rambouillet sheep, and it can be anywhere from 25 microns down to, 15. It can have horrible feet or terrible feet. It can be wool blind or not wool blind. It can have a 1-inch wool at the end of the year. It can have 5 inches. It just depends on the sheep and the genetic disposition that's been bred into it. But yeah, we definitely use our sheep as a efficiency maximizer or whatever. I don't know how to say that properly, but we run the beef cattle and the sheep. We commingle multi-species grazing. We're able to do that because we're all under fixed fences. A lot of operations can't because they're kind of more range nomadic type operations. And I think to me, the biggest thing that I've learned over my short career in the sheep industry is that the sheep that I have on my place won't work anywhere else but my place. And the sheep on your place won't work anywhere else but the sheep on your place. And if you're a beginning, beginning rancher, and you're really trying to figure out what am I going to do, I think it's really important to look at what everybody's doing, but understand your ranch is different than anywhere else in the country, and you need to find the best sheep that work for you. And that means taking risks, making mistakes, but measuring those mistakes and making adjustments.
Right.
And so kind of the next part of my question or deal I want to go through is let's kind of consider, take yourself out of what you're doing now and say, I'm a beginning rancher. And how do I go about selecting my perfect sheep? So what are the core, if you are looking at a blank slate and you're looking at a ranch, what's the first thing you're going to look at and evaluate to make your decision, to help
about what sheep,
your decision on what sheep?
About what sheep to buy, what sheep to start with?
Yeah.
That's a multi-layered question, isn't it? It's I
Yep.
think thinking through that a little bit, I think I would want to have at least some sense of my own abilities to handle sheep. I think that's a piece of it too. I think I mentioned last week the Barbados wethers that we bought when we decided to start selling meat at the farmer's market. And I think they were beyond the capability of most people to handle, which I didn't realize till we got them home. But I think kind of having some kind of honest assessment of your own abilities is part of that. I think for me, while I absolutely agree that every place is going to have sheep that fit that place, and what fits for you isn't going to fit for me and vice versa, I think talking to people that are raising sheep in your community, in your area, and asking them what they look for and what they keep versus what they sell, or what survives versus what dies, is something I'd want to do too. And knowing that you've got to make some decisions. There's no substitute for actually having sheep and seeing what works. But I think I would certainly go and talk to the other folks in the neighborhood and find out what they're raising and why. How about what would you do to start with?
Well, I really like your labor assessment, honest personal assessment of yourself, and if you're going to hire people, kind of the capabilities of that. That's, I think, really key. I think there's so many opportunities in the sheep in California now, especially with the custom grazing thing.
Yep.
But when you get into the custom grazing, I think it's really easy to underestimate the labor inputs that it takes. And so
Oh, absolutely.
You got to really be conscious of that. But to me, I think the first thing I would look at is I would make my list, but I would look at the type of sheep last. The first thing I would look at is resources.
Yep.
What's your resource? What kind of feed you have? What's the seasonality of the feed? How you can finish that lamb, if you're going to do a sheep dairy, if you're going to do fiber production or meat production, or a combination of the three, what really suits that resource the best is kind of that first question. Because if you're going to jump around from custom grazing place to custom grazing place, you need a thrifty animal that can really kind of take nutritional changes pretty well. If you got kind of a lush one area rotation, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
So I don't know, how would you, you do a lot of pasture work. What kind of, you got any insight on kind of pastures you would look for to really help sheep excel, and things that you really maybe need to look for more of a thrifty type breed when you're looking at feed?
I think that's kind of a
don't talk about goats.
What's that?
I said no goats, no goat feed.
No,
talk about goats.
I had goats for about a year and decided that I wasn't a goat guy. Yeah. I think there's a couple of layers to that question. So I think understanding the phases that your forage goes through in terms of its nutritional quality, thinking about matching, part of it I think is matching your production cycle and calendar with the forage availability that you think you'll have. So for example, I think a really good illustration for me is that we've, until this last year, have never had access to alfalfa stubble. And so we've always lambed in the springtime when we had lush feed available for ewes and lambs. If I had alfalfa available to me to go to in the fall, I may think about an entirely different production system, or at least have a fall and a spring lambing. So I think that's part of the consideration. I think because sheep have a more diverse dietary preference than cattle do, looking for a mix of nutritious broadleaf plants on a rangeland system as opposed to kind of a monoculture. Even though I love grazing ryegrass with the sheep, having some diversity in that plant mix is something I would look at on annual rangeland. I think the other piece of that, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around, is how animals learn what to graze. And there's some evidence out of Utah State Dr. Fred Provenza did some really pioneering work on kind of grazing behavior and preferences. And I've seen that at work in our sheep, where those ewes are exposed, like you said, with a custom grazing or targeted grazing situation. Those ewes eat what's in front of them because that's what they've learned to do. And I noticed that our lambs carry that forward, as opposed to when we buy sheep that are raised in a different system. The first time they're exposed to that stuff that our ewes will eat, but nobody else will, we lose some productivity. And so I think I would get some sense of what's in my pastures first. But then I also think there's some ways that we can manage sheep to fit them to what we have available. And maybe that is, again, going and looking at similar operations that are utilizing similar feed resources and starting from that standpoint. How do you, I mean, you run sheep and cows together, but what do you call sheep feed versus cow feed, and why?
Well, the simplification, the simple is broadleafs are sheep and cow feeds are grass. And even more simple, if you look at a sheep, they pick.
Yep.
And they eat a leaf. You look at a cow, they take their tongue and they just lap up a handful.
Yep.
And so they're not as selective.
Yep.
So if we have like a lot of foxtail, bronco, things like that, we try to get cows in there young. If we have a lot of burr clover, vetch, fillery, those kind of typical grasses, then the sheep will go in and pick it off. So it definitely evaluating the feed. We as a company, and me, I don't have a lot of experience going out into a new pasture, or a new range outside of my area and really breaking down, is this good feed, bad feed, moderate feed, what kind of value that is. I know my area pretty well, but outside of it, I'm pretty novice. What about water? Water is critical.
Yep.
But there's a lot of different ways to water. You want to talk a minute about the importance of clean, fresh water and how you distribute it and those kind of things, moving it to move the feed, those all.
Water is such a, I mean, it's an amazing management tool that we have with all livestock, but I think we kind of forget that with sheep sometimes. It's probably, in my estimation, clean, fresh water is the number one nutrient requirement of any livestock, because it's the driver for everything else. It drives their feed consumption, drives their thermoregulation, drives so many different aspects of their kind of physiological needs that it's really important. We do a couple of things. So one of the challenges here in the foothills is that we do have surface water available to us for irrigation and for stock water through our irrigation district. And our districts are a relic of the mining era, gold mining era in the foothills. And so it's mostly unlined ditches that have to be treated for aquatic weeds. And they're typically treated with a copper-based substance in the water. And so with copper toxicity being an issue with sheep, we have to pay pretty close attention to when they're treating the canal. We do haul water quite a bit. That's probably the biggest limiting factor in the little pieces of grazing land that we can pick up here, is that there's no water on it. And so we've figured out how to haul water efficiently and get water to sheep. We'll often put water at one point in a paddock that we've fenced, and then salt or protein at another point, so we can kind of get sheep moving back and forth and distribute the grazing pressure and the trailing to some extent. But
do you find that pretty effective, moving the salt to one side and the water to one? We always put it all the same and then move it if we want them to graze a little better.
Part of it depends on the year. And depends on the pasture. If we've got lots of flat ground, but it's all tilted about 30 degrees. So it's flat ground, but it looks like this. And I'm lazy enough not to want to pack salt blocks up to the top of that hill if I don't have to. So if that's where the water is, that's where the salt goes to. But
that's a good, that's a good, I never thought of splitting the mineral to the other side of the field for that. I've always kept it there under the idea that they won't seek it out like they seek out water. But really, that doesn't make any sense.
That,
They will
and
seek
it'd
it
be
out.
interesting. And I think sheep get trained to it too. That's the way our sheep have always been treated, and that's what they look for. And your sheep may be different. They may not know to look on the other side of it.
Yeah.
You know.
So then to jump and start moving through here, the other thing I think that needs to be evaluated when you're figuring out what kind of sheep you want is markets. How are you going to monetize these animals? What are you going to do? Are you going to sell replacement ewes? Are you going to sell meat lambs? Are you going to sell feeder lambs? Are you going to try to fatten them? All of those things have a feed requirement and a cost and a potential value. So how do you start if you don't know anything about the sheep? How do you start figuring out where you're going to sell your lambs?
You mean you actually have to sell them? You don't just keep all the ones you produce?
Yeah, you got to sell something. So
Oh,
you got too many boys running around if you don't.
Yeah, that's another diversity question, right? I mean, there's so much diversity in terms of not only how we market, but what people are looking for in the marketplace.
What are some of you want to list maybe real quick some of the potential markets you can sell into, be it meat or fiber or milk?
Yeah. So, one of the challenges for meat is that if you're going to sell legally, it's got to be USDA inspected. But that's a topic for a whole other episode. I think I'll use us as an example. When we got started, we knew that we wanted to sell directly to consumers at our farmers market, some freezer lambs, and then some restaurant lambs. And in talking with the folks that were coming to the farmers market about what they wanted to buy, they were probably, for not to disparage anybody's product, but they were looking for a smaller product, probably similar to what they perceived to be coming from New Zealand. And whether that's right or wrong, it was a smaller product than what was available typically in the supermarket here. So the other thing that we started with was a grass finished product. And because of lambing in the spring and having to carry those lambs through a grazing season on irrigated pasture, we went with a more moderate frame size than maybe the commercial lamb would be, because we felt like we could finish them on the forage that we had more efficiently and more cost effectively than something that was going to have to get to 140 or 150 pounds to finish. I think given where we market today, and we market our lambs at weaning to an ethnic market. So they're 70-pound live weight lambs in June that are being harvested at that point and probably sold as whole lambs in an ethnic market. That fits for our feed resource. If we were going to be selling feeders to somebody to put in a feedlot or to run on clover, our lambs probably aren't big enough to work for somebody like that. And so we're locked into a particular marketing channel that kind of fits the size and timing of our lambs coming off the ewe.
Yeah, I think that really hits on an important point when you're trying to think of these things, is that your genetic decisions your breeding times, your genetic decisions, your feed resources, and your capital all limit the type of market you can sell into. Because you have the standard commercial market where you can sell a feeder lamb to a feeder, or take it to the local auction yard and they'll sell it to a feeder, and that'll then go get fattened through a backgrounding channel, be it a feedlot or grass, and then sold fat. Or you can fatten it yourself on your own grass, but then whenever you're factoring that, you have to remember a percentage won't be fat, and so you have to have a way to sell those, because not all lambs will get fat. That's the reason we have finishing yards, feed yards, is for those lambs that don't get fat. And so it's really important, I think, just to identify your markets as a whole, and not like a sheep and buy a sheep. You got to know how you're going to be able to care for that sheep, and you need money coming in to take care of the animals that are there. So then the other side of that we touched on quite a few times, but kind of the added value abilities of sheep kind of is the last thing. Well, I guess second to last thing I have here is you want to talk about some of the things you do as far as fire protection grazing, or the industry does as far as fire protection grazing, custom grazing for different outfits. So kind of touch on some of those added value things that sheep have that most people aren't aware of, that there might be opportunities in.
I think we could spend all day talking about some of those opportunities, but to pick on just a couple, I think because sheep are easily managed, relatively easily managed for people that know what they're doing, we can put them into landscapes that we couldn't get other livestock or even other equipment into to manage for wildfire fuel, or to manage weeds or other types of vegetation management challenges. And so what I think there's this really interesting subset of our industry that's developed that is focused more on a service-based model than on a commodity production model. And it's not everybody that can do that well. I think it really takes people that can be out and explain to the public, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is how we get animals to the place that you need us to get them, and how we know when they're done there and need to move on. But that's, I think, becoming a really important part of the industry, especially here in California, where we've got this Mediterranean climate with dry, hot summers and high potential for wildfire. Grazing really is the only thing beyond fire that removes that vegetation. All the rest of our vegetation management alternatives, whether it's herbicides or mowing or any of those other techniques, still leave that flammable material on the landscape. Grazing goes in and takes that flammable material and converts it to meat and fiber and milk and other things. And then we take those animals off and hopefully don't burn. So I think from that standpoint, that's a real value added to not only to the animal's ability, but to the management capacity of the people that are doing it. And it does take a really high degree of management. I think the other, just to kind of tie this back into the marketing question that you had, we have found that even in our kind of specialized niche in terms of the size of our lambs, the time of year that we market, the type of wool that we produce, that there are some ways to add value to that beyond just calling up the processor and saying, I've got a load of lambs, what will you give me? Part of it is delivering a quality product. Even at the size lamb that we market, if our lambs are in full bloom when they go on the trailer, they do better for the person that bought them, just like they do better for us. And so that buyer now is willing to give us a little bit of a premium because he knows that we're going to deliver something that will perform well for him. Our wool's a similar situation. If we sell on the commodity market, our wool is valued as if it's California coarse wool. If we can find folks that want to do something a little different with that wool, whether it's hand spinning or some other kind of fiber art or some value added, mattresses or pillows or things of that nature, that adds value to what we sell as well. So I think marketing is more than just saying, here's my lambs, come and get them. Here's my wool, come and get it. Part of it is kind of knowing where that's going to fit for somebody too. What's your perspective on kind of that value added opportunity with sheep?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could spend. The idea of this topic is to open up 1,000 topics. So this is hopefully it'll be a preview for the next couple of shows, or we can go down a lot of these different wormholes. But to me, the sheep, it's such a diverse animal, and there's so many opportunities. But every opportunity takes effort, planning, and cost, and so you need to make sure that you understand what you're getting into and have it thought out before, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this topic, was to kind of touch on some of those general things so that hopefully if somebody's watching this and is thinking about how to, and even if you have an existing operation, how to kind of break down your operation and think about what you're doing and are you really maximizing what you have. Because in the wool, there is so many opportunities within wool to do different things. You touched on some opportunities for kind of that California coarse wool product. There's a lot of, I mean, the spinning market is absolutely unbelievable how big it's gotten in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's absolutely exploded, and it's a multi-million-dollar business. I mean, there's a lot of money generated in the spinning yarn market. And that used to be a niche thing, but now it's not. It's a legitimate business, and you got to just look at what you have, look at the resources that you have. There's a lot of different ways to add value to sheep. You can do it through the fact that they're a great digester of burnable fiber, and they turn it into nitrogen meat and wool that doesn't burn. Or you can, there's a lot of different ways. The last thing that I kind of want to touch on, and then I'll try to summarize it a little bit, is just understanding your environmental pressures. Is probably the last thing that I would probably circle as a major category and then break down what that is. In our area, it's coyotes are our biggest environmental pressure. Ravens are pretty damaging during lambing. We get an occasional skunk or raccoon that'll cause trouble. Domestic dogs are an issue. Urbanization can be an issue. There's a lot of factors that you won't think of when you first get into sheep that become issues very quickly. And so the more you can plan for some of these environmental pressures, the better you will be able to handle them when they happen, I think. And you're up there moving in the custom, in the small, bouncing around a lot of urban areas and stuff. Is there anything I left out as far as major environmental pressures that?
I think you hit the big ones, that they're going to be different depending on where you are. I think one of the things that has been interesting in our part of the world is the amount of time it takes just to explain to the neighbors what we're doing and why we're doing it. And, those types of things are part of that environment as well. And as California becomes more urbanized, it's a huge opportunity for us to explain what we're doing, particularly when we're grazing next to a subdivision or something like that. But it's also one of those challenges. The phone calls at 11:30 at night saying your guard dog's barking. Is there something wrong? Maybe can be solved by explaining what the guard dog's there to do, but that's part of the environment that all of us in California are dealing with, I think, too. And it takes a level of patience that I didn't fully appreciate when we started. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, if sheep don't teach you patience, the people will.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, to kind of wrap it up, if you're sitting there looking at maybe evaluating your current ranch or wanting to start something new somewhere, it's good to do an honest evaluation of yourself, your work ethic, and labor availability. So if you're going to hire people to do it, make sure you have that factored in and you have an honest understanding of the time commitment of your process. You do these added value things, it's going to take more labor than if you just call up and say, I'm delivering them Tuesday, what do I get?
Yeah.
Next thing is an evaluation of your resources. What kind of natural resources do you have on hand? What kind of supplementation do you need to do? And that includes everything from pasture management, seasonality of pastures, water assessment, and minerals. The next thing would be is how are you going to monetize these? What markets are you going to sell into what? Are you going to just focus on wool production? Are you going to sell milk and have a whole dairy infrastructure tied to it? Are you going to just go for meat? Are you going to try to finish your lambs? Are you going to try to run them all away? But really try to figure out that marketing. And with that, be aware of those added value opportunities when you're doing it, because the best sheep herders extract as much value as they can out of one animal unit as possible. And then finally, evaluate your environmental pressures. If you're going to be grazing close to the city, make sure you factor into that time commitment that you're going to have to spend with the neighbors. Make sure you factor in the possibilities of the neighbors' dogs getting in there. Make sure you factor in the cost of running livestock guardian dogs or not. The electric fence requirements that are going to be needed in some of those areas are a lot more or less. And then if you're out in the middle of the country, do you have bears? Do you have lions? Do you have eagles? What kind of environmental pressures are going to put pressure on your herd? And then once you kind of have those generally figured out, I think it's actually fairly easy to sit back and look at some of these different breeds and find one of the, a breed that really matches well or meshes well with it. You can get, I know some of those English breeds that you run are fierce protectors of their lambs, whereas some of the more fine wool type sheep, they're happy to sacrifice their third lamb, and they have trouble counting to one sometimes. So it really, I think those factors, I think that gives you a really good base to kind of make a general assessment of what kind of genetics you need in your sheep. And then once you have that idea, get some sheep and then work within those genetics. Play with that, make sure, and then be willing to admit a mistake and sell all those and sell all the Barbados and buy a bunch of cotton, or whatever the term is. But
and I think something that kind of the caveat to that is, don't go with the latest fad either. Don't start with one set of genetics and decide next year that you're going a whole different direction. Let your breeding program make progress in the genetics that you've selected and fitting your environment. Stick with something a couple of years to kind of get some sense of what works and what doesn't.
I imagine we'll have a couple talks on genetics, but genetics for me, they're never finite. Genetics are directional. You're always making directional decisions with your genetics. So your decision is never the final, and there is no perfect sheep. There's just a good direction.
That's right. That's exactly right. So where can people follow you while they're not watching you on YouTube? Are you on Instagram or anything?
Man, yeah. Well, yes, I'm on Instagram at California Sheep Rancher. I know I've seen you there once or twice. I saw some sheep eating a bush they weren't known to eat. I think one of your last posts, enjoying some sagebrush.
Yes, at Flying Mule is my Instagram handle. So folks can check us both out there during the week if they have sheep withdrawals.
Yeah,
they can check that out.
Message there or put a comment in the video post or something, and we'll be until next week.
It's all about sheep stuff you should know.
There you go. All right, man. We'll catch you in a week.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Bye-bye.